Last time we talked about the front line in Ukraine, we did a YouTube video about, or we released a segment on YouTube about the Ukrainian counteroffensive in the Kursk area, which has had some minimal success in taking some, farmland back and some village homes back and pushing into these villages and around this area, right? They've had real success up here. Now, it's not the type of success where they're making big threats to strategically significant locations in the bigger terms of the war in its whole, i.e. we're threatening the city of Kursk. Anyway, the counteroffensive did not have much success out of taking a few villages in this area and pushing back some of the Russian positions here, which could help reinforce the Ukrainian flank in this direction. Now, the Russians are still massively pushing from the western direction, and that doesn't mean they aren't pushing down here as well. They are pushing from the southern direction, but pushing very, very hard from the west and taking massive armored casualties. The Ukrainians are taking armored casualties with their counteroffensive as well. Their counteroffensive seems a little bit more limited, and so with that comes limited casualties. The Russian offensives are continuous and ever expanding, and so we're getting pretty massive casualties from there. But any attempt from the Ukrainians to move forward, especially with mechanized columns that they have tried to do, is going to come with casualties and armor that are not necessarily very easy to replace. The same thing is true with the Russians, but the Russians simply just have more. And so the Ukrainian counteroffensive has taken back some villages, not much more than that, helped reinforce this flank, took some territory that they had lost in the previous few months, but the West is still getting attacked very, 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 very aggressively, extreme pressure. But with 3 days until Trump getting into the White House, and maybe 15 to 18-ish days until this month's over, we are about halfway, a little bit over halfway through the month, the Russian goal of pushing the Ukrainians out of Kursk by January looks ever more grim. And the purpose of this was to set it up for negotiations so that the Ukrainians don't have any leverage in Kursk to make that point in any potential negotiation. So I would assume the real deadline was the 20th. So that's in 3 days. Are they going to make that goal? Almost certainly not. Now, are they going to make the goal by the end of the month? I would say that is very, very unlikely. That's not to say that it is impossible, as I do not know the situation exactly on the ground, and the Russians are crawling forward ever so slowly, even if it is at a painfully slow pace. And, we're talking about before, it was like, oh, snap. Now they've lost 10% of what they occupied. 20%, 30%. Oh my gosh, it's up to 35%. Now it's crawling slowly forward to 36, 37, 38. We've gotten to 40, and now we're getting to like 41, 42. And with the Ukrainians still feeling that they have the punching power to launch some counteroffensives in this area, I just don't see it happening by the Russian deadline, meaning that it is going to be the case almost certainly that the Ukrainians are going to have territory in Kursk by the time Trump gets inaugurated, and going into February, as the third anniversary of the Russian invasion, the large-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine on February 24th comes around again. Now, will this end up mattering politically in the immediate term if negotiations fall through, which I think at this point, considering we have yet to hear any major updates, which of course we don't know what could be happening closed doors, it is a very likely possibility? No. This will continue to be a thorn in the side of the Russians politically and domestically, and if they can hold on to this all the way until they sit at a table to negotiate some ceasefire or long-term agreement, then yes. But again, this territory is of no significance strategically. This territory is of no real significance tactically, unless you talk about like diversion. And I had this conversation yesterday with Professor Goltz on the program from the University of Notre Dame. As much as we can talk about the troops that were diverted from this area, when I see the Bradleys and I see the Martyrs and I see the Abrams and I see the Leopards and I see all of the firepower and artillery systems and really crack Ukrainian units dedicated to the Kursk incursion, and then I hear somebody, hear the talking point of, well, these units have helped divert them from the Donetsk region. That is true, but they've also had to go on the attack to make that diversion happen. And going on the attack is going to cost more than to be on the defense, just generally speaking, especially in this war. And so when I see these like continued Ukrainian counterattacks in these areas, which would probably be happening elsewhere as well to some extent, maybe not as mechanized, but who knows, I wonder, and especially when I think about the initial push over the border and all the armor that's been lost, it is true that they diverted these troops, but would the cost to the Ukrainian attacker and that ratio that is inflicted upon anyone trying to take a position because of the initial cost placed upon any attacker, as the defender is defending in their entrenched position, they have the entrenched position, they have the defenses there, they've placed the mines, they have the drones in the sky constantly looking for targets. Wouldn't those units be better used in a defensive position in Donetsk, even if these units are fighting over there? Because, okay, you don't divert them from Donetsk, they go back to Donetsk. Well, these units would be in Donetsk too, using this good equipment in a fighting defensive position. Now, the most of the fighting in Kursk for the last months has been defensive. But still, being in Kursk to get in and to continue to do counteroffensives like this, they do have to go on the offense, and they are using in demand, low supply, and when I say low supply, meaning they don't have a ton of them, armored vehicles in order to continue to hold this leverage. And so strategically, when it comes like to the tactics of it, that's not to say that, you know, the impact on the domestic political scene could not be taken into consideration. That's not to say the leverage could not be taken into consideration. I mean, Clausewitz said, you know, all war is politics, of course. And so if you can, you know, war is an extension of politics. And so if you can exchange this for something you want, then it could still be of use. But strategically, tactically, in the short term, this is a bet. This is a bet on a future diplomatic investment and a possible bet on the costs bearing upon Russia domestically from everybody that's been displaced, from just the general news of the fact that the Ukrainians are continuing to occupy Russian land, the fact that they haven't been pushed out, the fact that, you know, depending on movement, more people could be displaced, on top of all of the already building economic domestic pressures. So is that bet going to succeed? Are they going to be able to turn in these casino chips, as it were, this Kursk casino chip, in order to get a cash out somewhere else, maybe territory back in the Kherson territory or in Zaporizhia? Who knows? But that might very well be the bet, and is what I think the bet is. Because, you know, people talk a lot about momentum. People talk a lot about having to spread out the Russian units along the line. But when you, and wanting to make it so the Russians have to spread out the units along the line, which is useful, at the end of the day, the Ukrainians have a manpower crisis. And when I'm talking to troops who are fighting elsewhere outside of Kursk, you get all these different opinions all around. Well, it is good because they're diverting these, and it's good that we're taking the fight to them, all the way to this is a complete waste of resources. All these resources should be dedicated to defending Pokrovsk. All these resources, imagine what the Battle of Toretsk would look like right now if these resources were there. Even if the Russians were there, we'd have more ammunition, we'd have more men in the trenches, we'd be able to do much more damage, and we'd be able to hold this ground much better. Now, to be clear, they'd still be losing stuff no matter what, because the manpower crisis is everywhere. And they don't have enough manpower dedicated in Kursk to completely stabilize everything. But if it was enough to go across the border and occupy stuff, it certainly is enough to reinforce one of the major battles happening all across the front line right now. So that's the situation in Kursk. Tactically and strategically, questionable. Diplomatically, useful if they can be able to cash in the chip and hold on to it until negotiations arrive, whether that be in the next few months or within the next year to 2 years. So that's the situation right now in the Kursk direction. As outside of the Kursk direction, if we were to go to say, where's the next area we should cover? We could say that, for example, let's just briefly go over the areas that is basically all the same. The Volchansk axis, basically the same. Same with Lipsy, near Kharkiv. Haven't seen any movement in that area. When you go over to Kupiansk, the Russians have been unable to get into the city of Kupiansk. since their mad dash that they made earlier, the city, they've been, if you don't remember, they were able to dash into the city for a brief moment before getting pushed out. They've been unable to follow that up in the last month since it has occurred. And the Russians are continuing to try to push now southward. See, a big reason why they wanted Kupiansk is they wanted to be able to take the city, not only because the Ukrainians took it back and it would be reversing a huge humiliation, not only because they want to take more and more of the Kharkiv region, but also because they want to put more pressure down southward on major Donetsk cities that are still left unoccupied. When we talk about the Donetsk region, a lot of Donetsk is still unoccupied and resisting occupation. In Slovansk, in Kramatorsk, in Konstantinivka, in Limon, in all of these, Donetsk locations, if they're able to push southward from here, then they can put pressure on them from the north on top of the pressure that's coming to them from the east, and possibly in some directions, like in Seversk, from the south as well. If that was to come to pass, that would make the situation in Donetsk, which is already extremely difficult, just that much more difficult, which is why people were very scared when that mash dash happened into Kupiansk. Now, you can see that they're still going down southward anyway, even if they haven't captured Kupiansk. If they captured Kupiansk, then they wouldn't be getting pressured from two sides. It would be probably much easier. As you can see, Ukrainian drones are targeting them and trying to turn the Russian units here into Swiss cheese to try to stop them from going down slowly. If they took Kupiansk and they could just transport their supplies down southward, then not only could they add pressure southward, but the logistics southward would be much simpler, meaning the pressure they could bear down on the south would be harder, and they'd be able to push downwards towards cities like possibly Limon, Slovansk, etc. And so they are trying to push southward, but as you can see, because they're on pressure from two sides here and they still haven't been able to clean up this pocket in Kupiansk across the river here, across the Oskil River, the Russians are still having difficulty, and the situation there has not changed all that dramatically. Some areas where the situation has changed dramatically, and I would like to bring some attention to it. The first one is in Chasiv Yar. This is Chasiv Yar. I filmed there. I know some displaced people from there, and the Russians have crossed the canal that was dividing the city of Chasiv Yar from this little extension, this little community extension over here. They crossed it. They've been able to catch quite a bit of the city itself, as you can see in these communities and these homes separated here. And now they're pushing through into the middle, into the central parts of Chasiv Yar. They've captured roughly, I would say, about 50% of Chasiv Yar itself at this point. That's not like a hard prediction. It might be 40%, it might be 45%, but as you can see here, they are making progress, and they've solidly gone over the canal. That's not to say that the Ukrainians aren't hitting them with drones. They're not bringing a lot of casualties down upon them. Where the Russians advance everywhere, they're taking high casualties. The problem just is there's too many Russians. And so for the Russians that fall down, they have other Russians to replace them. Now, there's complaints in many Russian units about manpower issues, and these issues will become more pronounced the longer this goes on, as they have to pay more and more to recruit soldiers. And, with these attacks and with these pressure and trying to keep this pressure throughout all of winter, now going into January, February, it takes a lot of men to do that. But for the meantime, for the next few months, I have no reason to believe that they're going to be made to stop that pressure, because they have enough men for the short term. Long term, it's going to be a lot harder unless you do a mass mobilization. But in the short term, it's a little difficult. It's a little more difficult for Ukraine. It's a lot more difficult. And if Ukraine makes those mobilization decisions, then the question is moved over to, and they're given proper assistance by the West, which is of course still in the air. Then the question moves to the Russians about mobilization to try to continue to keep the pressure, which is a huge domestic political question mark. And the only time Vladimir Putin has lost real support in Russia, where you could see it in the Russian polling, and it's Russian polling conducted in Russia with the knowledge of the consequences that can come with it. The only time it took a massive multi-point, like double-digit point drop was when he did mobilization last time. So another wave of mobilization after 3 years of war, when he said it was going to be done and dusted within a few weeks. Yeah, it's kind of hard to make that bet. A lot of people can, live with the war around them, but maybe not want to pick up the rifle themselves. And so, of course, that question is still in the air. But in the meantime, in the short term, The pressure continues. Chasiv Yar is being fought street by street, room by room. Moving on, Toretsk. This is big news around Toretsk. We had some people in the chat in the last few days saying Toretsk has fallen. And at this point, it's kind of blurry to say exactly what has happened. People are asking me to cover it. And the reason that I haven't covered it is, number one, I kind of wait until, we solidly know and we don't have any photographic or video evidence to prove that, all of Toretsk has been captured. And number two, there's no reason I can't wait until I know for sure. So even, as of right now, until I know it's geolocated that the Ukrainians have been pushed out of all of Toretsk and the communities attached to it, then I'm not going to announce that Toretsk has fallen, or the entire city and outlying communities of Toretsk has fallen. And the reason why is this fight has been going on for a very, very, very long time. And it has been sometimes push and go. And while I don't believe the Ukrainians are going to be pushing out the Russians, I want to make sure that I properly document when the Ukrainians get pushed out. Because the difference between the Ukrainians getting pushed out today and Ukrainians getting pushed out in a month or two could have significant impact depending upon supplemental deals, depending upon continued American aid packages, training programs, permissions, all sorts of stuff. Not to mention just like the time it takes, like 2 months is time to train people, replace people, etc. So even if I am pretty certain that Toretsk is going to fall, and I'm also pretty sure, less certain but sure, that it's going to fall closer and sooner rather than later, it could be as soon as a week, it could be something like a month, I don't know for sure. The question for me is how long until it, and when it does, will the fighting be taken to Konstantinivka, which is a big logistical point for troops fighting in Chasiv Yar, for troops fighting in Toretsk currently, and for troops fighting in all the villages around this area. There's also a decent amount of civilians who still live in Konstantinivka last time I was there, which was, I think, during, a very recent trip, actually. A very recent trip, right before I left Ukraine. And, I mean, the different places in Konstantinivka are getting hit more. The situation there is difficult, but Konstantinivka being made a frontline city, as in soldiers are trying to enter it itself, would be absolutely disastrous considering how much the city has already been through and how much many of its community members have fought on the front line to try to keep the front line from being dragged back to it. Not to mention, it just shows how deeper and deeper into the nets the Russians could claw. So that's why, exactly when Toretsk falls matters, and whether or not the Ukrainians can have new defensive positions behind Toretsk in order to defend Konstantinivka in time matters. So announcing exactly it has fallen in its entirety does matter. But as you can see, putting all that aside, the vast majority of Toretsk has been captured. I know Lut and some other Ukrainian units are fighting over here. I got some offers to embed with some mortar teams around Toretsk. We never ended up doing that because I thought it was going to be in Toretsk, and then it ended up being around Toretsk, and then some stuff changed and whatever. But point is, the fighting around Toretsk has been very brutal. A lot of street by street fighting. And in that fighting, there have been Ukrainian counteroffensives, Russian counteroffensives to the Ukrainian counteroffensives, and constant Russian assaults and pouring of manpower, just like there is stories like this for Avdiivka, just like there's stories like this for Bakhmut, just a pouring of Russian manpower into the city. But the Ukrainians, again, when it's a manpower battle, while they can take a defensive position to make it more painful for them to advance, at the end of the day, the Russians had more men and have been able to capture the vast majority of the city and are now starting to push into the surrounding communities where the Ukrainian defending units that were pushed out of the city are now holding new positions, trying to hold the Russians back from capturing all of the surrounding area and the little pieces of Toretsk that are still held by the Ukrainian defenders. The longer they can hold this area, the more time it gives the Ukrainian authorities to build defenses elsewhere, which we gotta hope and we gotta pray that they are making. We also have some updates on some movement in this direction for the Russians as they're trying to push and prod around Pokrovsk. The reason that they would be pushing in this way, even though you don't see anything of extreme strategic significance directly above it, to its left, you can see Pokrovsk and Mirorod, its twin city. And from here, the plan for Pokrovsk becomes pretty obvious. They plan to not only advance from Pokrovsk from the southern direction, which they have tried to do, but they've been hit hard when they try to do it by Ukrainian drones, particularly. And I've been with those southern Pokrovsk Ukrainian drone teams with the 68th, and they've been doing a lot of damage. But it's just, even if the Russians have more men, it's too difficult to just assault it over and over and over head on. So what they've done in many other cities, and what they look to be repeating here, is they've tried to go to the left of the city, advance to the left, push to the left, so they can slowly surround it from the left and attack it both from the north and the west. And while they're attacking it from the north and the west, and this has been the big threat, particularly the western threat, as we've seen these villages around the west here fall to the Russian advance, now we're seeing the Russians try to prod to the east of it. And if they were able to capture these villages around here, then they could push pressure on the twin city of Mirorad, which is attached to Pokrovsk, while pushing from the west, if they can continue to push in this direction. And then they're attacking both Pokrovsk and its twin city from 3 directions, making its defense all that more difficult and its resupply all that more difficult. Because it means that the people bringing supplies and munitions into Pokrovsk, and I've tried to go into Pokrovsk quite a lot. I've driven into Pokrovsk, and there's certain ways where you have to be like, we can't go this way, we have to go this other way, because if we go this way, which is much faster directly into Pokrovsk, it will actually be within drone range, and so we're going to take a longer path, which is much longer but safer. And the more they close in, the more people have to make those logistical decisions, until eventually there is no safe logistical decision. It's, well, this route is suicide, this route we've got a chance of survival. And that's what it was like in Kurakhove during the end. I remember talking to the 33rd, but what it was like to get into Kurakhove. I mean, not even towards the end, but months before it fell. And they said it was like flipping a coin on whether to get in there. Which, whether or not is an exaggeration, I don't know. But I have good reason to believe from multiple reports that the troops going into Kurakhove were really shredded quite a lot with the Russian drones trying to strain their supply lines. Destroying supplies and manpower that Ukraine desperately needs. And the more that the Russians are able to get into those favorable defensive positions so they can shell the logistics and troops and wounded being transported in and out of the city, the less and less, both tactically, locally, it is good to defend the city, or beneficial to defend the city, as in it's going to cost them more and more and more to hold the same position. And strategically, as in the general amount of manpower, as in, oh, we need to dedicate 3,000 to 4,000 more troops to defend this area, when we need all those troops to defend, for example, against continued Russian assaults in Kursk, against continued Russian assaults in the Toretsk direction, or around Velyka Novosilka, which is actually one of the next topics of conversation. Velyka Novosilka and the Kurakhove direction. So first Kurakhove, then Velyka Novosilka. This is where the 33rd and their Leopard crews, which I tried desperately to get interviews with, and they agreed, but every time we'd go there to do the interview, it's like, sorry, fire mission, and then we'd see some footage on social media later of them, you know, fighting, and sometimes it was just straight up tank battles, which are very, very, very rare in this war. Other times it's, you know, bombing incoming troops. Other times it's just strafing the enemy positions to make sure they don't get too comfortable, and slowing down their assaults to make sure, you know, just making sure that all of their incursions and all of the territory and trenches they hold, all their forward operating positions, are facing some sort of pressure. So they have to keep their heads down so they don't just feel comfortable to just random set up mortars and artillery wherever and whenever, and comfortable to fire and shell down range. And so in this direction, the fighting was very brutal. But the Russians have completely captured the city of Kurakhove, which the Ukrainians defended for months, and they're now pushing forward towards this village here, which is currently I guess like the second village out from Constantinople from the eastern direction. The troops that were fighting in Kurakhove have been redeployed here. All of the troops that were holding these villages here withdrew. They probably held these villages too long. I would not be surprised if they took at least notable casualties in the withdrawal process, because of how, you know, narrow their withdrawal corridor was, and the fact that the Russians almost certainly knew. Now, I'm not even going to say certainly. Had to know, unless they were mentally deficient, that they had to withdraw in the near future, means that they could have been like monitoring those corridors to wait for movement and then hit it as hard as they can for any withdrawing Ukrainian troops, which is part of the reason why, as much as you want to hold land, you can't wait till the exact last second to withdraw in some type of hold every inch of territory to the last man strategy. As much as that's very brave and romantic, it actually gets a lot of men killed pointlessly and could actually lead to you losing decisions in the front line, breaking down if your units are not managed correctly. Anyway, they've been pushed out, and now I've filmed in Constantinople. I filmed the civilian evacuations because they knew that the Russian advance was probably going to come towards here and Andriivka in the near future. I remember being told by some people, and when I say some, I mean I'm saying some as in to indicate multiple, both some commentators online and a few soldiers, that the fall of Constantinople will probably be the end of the battle for southern Donetsk. Now, that doesn't mean it's the end of the battle for Donetsk, because there's still Pokrovsk. I mean, not Pokrovsk, because Pokrovsk is technically is in the Zaporizhia region, but there's still Solovansk, there's still Kramatorsk, there's still Konstantinivka. There's still technically the battle for Toretsk, Limon. There's still all these other locations that are being fought for, but these are basically the last known positions of Ukrainian resistance in southern Donetsk. And so what the Russians are trying to do here is completely push the Ukrainians out of southern Donetsk, not only so they can have, they can finish that part and they can move on to other endeavors, just generally speaking, but also with these positions, it's going to make it much harder for the Ukrainians to defend these villages and all these positions, which are now going to be pressed not just from the south, but also more from the east, which means that Ukrainian defense positions all across different areas around, particularly Zaporizhia, could be at risk. So not only are we talking about, the loss of southern Donetsk and the last stand, really, of the Ukrainian defenders of southern Donetsk, but we're also talking about increased pressure on the Zaporizhia region, as well as almost certainly the redeployment of these troops to other areas. Maybe it'd be around Pokrovsk and, for example, to try to finish the capturing of all of Donetsk to move towards northern Donetsk up here, or be redeployed for example, Velyka Novosilka, which is the most obvious example of this exact phenomenon of the pressure that's going to be put on Zaporizhia that's happening right now. And I've warned about this on the channel before, and I'm now warning about it again, as a position around Velyka Novosilka has reached its most critical status yet. So for those of you who don't know, this little town of Velyka Novosilka was supposed to be part of the Ukrainian defensive line defending the Zaporizhia region. Now, up until, I would say mid-2024, this actually was basically performing its purpose. But the problem was that after the fall of Volodar, where I believe the 72nd and a lot of other Ukrainian units did immense damage to the Russian attackers, but once there was not enough rotations, not enough resupply, not enough manpower to hold Volodar, and the 72nd was really just fighting with whatever they had left, and they withdrew from the city, and the Russians took it over. The flank protecting Velyka Novosilka, which made it, the flank supporting it, which made the link of chain stronger together, the one next to it snapped and broke, which then made this link in the chain weaker, because not only could it be attacked from the south, and before, all these villages were uncaptured. These villages were captured after the fall of Volodar because they've had to pull back more and more and more because of this pressure from the west. Now they're being attacked not only from the south, they're now being attacked from the west, and that's been an issue for a while since the fall of Volodar, but now they're also being attacked from the north. Now this happened earlier, maybe about a month ago or 2 or 3 weeks ago, that they tried to cross and take this village here to surround it, and then the Ukrainians launched a counteroffensive and pushed them back. But now it's been a few weeks, and the Russians are trying again. And not only are they trying again, but they're trying again after capturing all the villages to the south of Velyka Novosilka, and these two villages that are directly connected into Velyka Novosilka, as they pepper the city with drone attacks, with toss strikes, with artillery strikes, and do everything they can to shake up, damage, and make it the Ukrainian defenders in the city, so that the Russian storming troops can storm into the village, into the town, take this defensive position and take one of the first real, you could say, major defensive positions or significant defensive positions in this Zaporizhia wall that is no longer just going to be attacked from the south, but also the west as well, which is why its fall would be so significant, because its fall would indicate that the Ukrainian manpower problem is bad enough that they'd rather just, and I don't mean to put this, that they're going to have to give up these villages in these area and just have to reorganize at the next closest major pillar because they just don't have enough manpower right now. And so in order to, keep the pressure on in Kursk and keep the pressure on elsewhere, they're going to have to give up loads or swaths of farming land and farming villages all throughout this area in Zaporizhia. If they were to lose Velyka Novosilka, as well as make the situation for the Zaporizhian defenses at locations like Hulepole, or even further and further and further until you get to Zaporizhia itself, more difficult down the line, say 4 or 5 months from now, as Russian soldiers will attempt to, presumably, continue to push in this direction and try to advance and continue upon the gains they've made to capture Velyka Novosilka, that first pillar in the first place. And so the situation about Velyka Novosilka is probably the one I'm most immediately concerned about. Same with the situation around Toretsk. Kherson, the situation has not changed. Constant civilian attacks, constant bombing of civilians with drones. As you can see, there's more drone attacks in this area. But it's not just there, it's other locations as well. It's just that's the place that's most notorious for it. And there has also been, of course, some probing stuff down south in Zaporizhia in this area. But no major Russian assaults or major Russian attacks. There have been Russian attacks in this area, which have been repelled, but no major mechanized Russian assaults that we've heard rumors of for quite a while. So that is the current status, generally speaking, of the front line as of January 17th, 3 days before Trump's inauguration, and with no word on an imminent peace deal or ceasefire come January 20th or 21st, this situation will likely continue to develop going into the new year. And while this is the picture we were waiting, anticipating to see in anticipation of any peace deal, if there's no peace deal, then this is nothing but another frame and a very large picture book. Okay. Any questions?